Good afternoon. The City Commission is convening to consider the existence of cause for an intermediate interim suspension of the liquor license at the International African Restaurant and Nightclub due to public safety and health concerns in accordance with Fargo Municipal Code Section 251512 and subsequent to the Liquor Control Board's recommendation of suspension pending further proceedings. Commissioner Pepcorn, could you address this to Commission, please?
Sure. Would you like me to make the motion, or are we going to have the chief speak first? But
you could make a motion and then we could have a discussion. That'd be fine.
Very good. I'll make the motion. I move that the commission find cause exists to immediately suspend the liquor license of the International African Restaurant and Nightclub, LLC, in accordance with the Fargo Municipal Code Section 25-1512B6, in that the licensee conducts his business in a manner which results in, encourages, or is conducive to the creation of disturbances of the peace, disorderly conduct, or any other violations of federal, state, and/or city laws. I further move that liquor sales cease immediately pursuant to the license issued by the City of Fargo, pending hearing on the matter to be scheduled at a later time.
Is there a second?
Second.
Open for discussion. Chief Zabowski, do you want to give what the liquor board got the other day?
Yes, sir.
Just so the commissioners can, I don't know all the commissioners, you didn't see the liquor board, so we could have him present.
Absolutely. I'll give you the same summary. On February 14th, 2021 at 1:39 a.m., officers responded to an active fight between 8 and 10 individuals in the parking lot of the Africa nightclub. During the incident, when the officers arrived, up to 10 individuals were actively fighting. We spoke with the manager, Mr. Brown, and this was now at 2:03 a.m. The officers noted that the bar was still very full of patrons, approximately 75 people. Several patrons were standing in close proximity to the bar and were holding alcoholic bottles. During the investigation of the fight, one of the security guards was interfering with the officers' investigation by advising patrons not to talk to the police and just to leave the premise, and obviously obstructed our ability to investigate the fight. While we continued on scene, 2:10 a.m., they observed that people were starting to exit the premise. But at 3 a.m., through the open front door, as the sergeant went to provide a liquor establishment form to Mr. Francis, he could observe through the open glass door approximately 6 individuals standing next to, leaning on, or standing behind the bar top. He could clearly see what appeared to be an employee pouring a bottle of Crown Royal into a glass positioned in front of several others, and that there were mixed drinks on the bar top directly next to the individuals. When Sergeant Bowman addressed this with Mr. Brown, he indicated that his patrons were allowed to finish their drinks even if it was after 2 a.m. Now, the 3 a.m. was obviously employees. He was somewhat resistive to that fact that they are unable to drink after hours as well. They're there only to clean and maintain the facility. As a follow-up to this, and as the department started looking more closely at licensed establishments and those that were particularly causing disorder in the city, I met with Mr. Brown on March 11th to discuss specifically the issues with his security guards interfering with our investigations, as well as to suggest to him that he purchase and implement an ID scanner to prevent underage youth from being inside of his establishment. He was very receptive to that. It was a good conversation, and we went on our way. From there, we began to see another troubling pattern of calls. I'm just going to give you the overview. On April 2nd of 2021, at 12:50 p.m., our officers responded to a 911 hang-up call at the Africa Club. There were voices in the background. It didn't sound like there were any problems. The line disconnected. When we got there, we met with staff who said they may have accidentally called 911. On April 2nd, at 10:58 p.m., a very intoxicated female reported there were underage kids in the club and hung up on dispatch. Again, our officers responded, spoke with the owner of the club, Mr. Brown, who said they had to remove a very intoxicated female from the club. He told officers that they are very good about scanning all IDs and making sure to remove any minors or anyone who causes a problem. That's an important fact to remember. That's April 2nd, in which they had the scanner on premise. On April 3rd, at approximately 11:01 p.m., our officers responded there again for a loud party and people. A citizen reported they could hear the bass from the music coming from the club, and it was shaking their house. Officers spoke with management and advised them that their bass was affecting neighboring homes. They asked if they would turn it down. The staff indicated that that was their normal level for the club. On April 11th, 12:09 a.m., dispatch received a call from someone at the club that involved a lot of yelling and screaming and not much information. Again, as in many of these instances, because of the size of the crowd and the hour in which we're getting sent, multiple officers often respond to these calls. We arrived on scene, found a female complainant who was upset with the club because she was being asked to leave. She claimed she was assaulted at the club on a prior date but did not want to contact the police about it. Management requested she leave and be trespassed. The officers subsequently did that and waited for her to leave the scene. On April 24th at 12:34 a.m., staff reported there was a female in their parking lot discharging a firearm in the air in an attempt to stop individuals involved in a physical domestic. Again, multiple officers responded to this call, detained multiple individuals. The female was arrested. She was armed for aggravated reckless endangerment and physical obstruction of government function. Another male was arrested for preventing arrest, a felony charge. Multiple people were trespassed. During this incident, it was discovered that one of the involved individuals was a minor and was in the liquor establishment. This in light of the fact that they had an ID scanner that they said they were diligent about using. On April 25th, 2:27 p.m., an employee with the club reported that he was assaulted by an individual 2 days prior at the club. Again, he didn't want to report it officially, but he wanted our officers to document in case the suspect returned and caused problems. On May 29th at 11:20 p.m., we were sent over there for very intoxicated people on a party bus that had just left the Africa Club. So our officers were sent to the 3800 block of Main. It's about a mile and a half from the establishment, which the party bus had to pull over and stop because the 30 patrons they had picked up from the Africa nightclub were intoxicated to the point that some of them began to urinate inside the bus. Again, multiple officers had to respond to this situation. The intoxicated patrons were alleging that they had a contract with the bus driver. The bus driver didn't want to do anything more because of the disorderly conduct and the urination. And so to resolve this issue, several of our officers rode on the bus with the patrons so they could get back to their hotel. Other officers had to follow in a squad to resolve this situation of over-intoxication. On May 30th, at 12:53 a.m., we were sent to the nightclub for a possible fight. When we arrived, parties had left. Staff said it was only verbal, but officers were unable to verify that and were unable to make contact with any of the involved parties. On May 30th, again, same evening at 1:31 a.m., officers were sent back to intoxicated people fighting in the parking lot. A female was assaulted by a male. During the fight, her cell phone was damaged. They subsequently were interviewed by officers and left the tavern. A second call came in at 2:15 a.m. in which the same female was followed home by the person from the club and assaulted at her residence. Okay. All right, missed a couple here. Going backwards, on May 23rd, of course, at 2:11 a.m., we were sent to a gunshot homicide. Again, multiple officers were required for this. The victim of the homicide was, in fact, a security guard employed by the club. I'm going to come back to that in more detail in a second. But following that homicide a week later were the last several incidents that I talked about. So in terms of the homicide on May 23rd, it's still an active homicide investigation, so there's a lot of information that we are aware of, but we can't provide publicly, but there are many facts that we will be able to provide to you today. In synopsis, this happened about 2:11 a.m. We were sent there to the parking lot to the west side of the club. Dominique McNair, who was a security guard working at the club, was shot in the parking lot and subsequently died from his injuries. The synopsis details the following: that the nightclub security uses an electronic scanning device to scan individuals' identification prior to them entering to ensure they are 21 years or older. However, in the course of this investigation, the officers identified that there was a 20-year-old in the nightclub during the time of this incident. In checking the scanner, the individual's information was not in there. So somehow this individual got into the tavern and was not scanned in or was allowed in. Dominique McNair was working in the capacity of security guard for the nightclub. Mr. Brown was the manager, stated he hired Mr. McNair approximately 1 week earlier to work security. Mr. Brown was unable to provide law enforcement with a paper or electronic record of Mr. McNair's employment. He told law enforcement that he leaves it up to his employees whether or not they want to be on the books and receive a paycheck or be paid in cash at the end of the shift. He also stated that all but one of their security personnel are paid in cash at the end of each shift, and that McNair had elected to also be paid in cash. Prior to the shooting, several individuals who had visited the nightclub were gathered in the parking lot to the west. Multiple security personnel employed by the club told law enforcement that Mr. Brown has instructed them to clear the parking lots of people after the bar closes. This includes the off-property parking lot to the west. Multiple security personnel employed by the club told law enforcement they carry handguns when they clear the parking lot after bar closing. Mr. Brown told law enforcement he has no knowledge of his security carrying handguns. Prior to the shooting, Mr. McNair was in the west lot telling people to leave. Another security employee, also armed, was out there as well. Security and patrons from the club told law enforcement that nightclub security pats down customers at the door to see if they have weapons. If a handgun is discovered, the nightclub employee will retain the handgun on site and return it to the patron when they leave the nightclub. This, of course, is not lawful conduct. On top of it, the person who was collecting the weapons, Mr. McNair, is a convicted felon. So Mr. McNair, who was armed and was collecting guns, each person coming into the club and checking a gun, each gun that he had contact with is a separate felony offense. Video footage shows at least 3 individuals inside the nightclub holding what appear to be handguns, and I'll show you that in a second. So the faces have been covered up, obviously, as a result of the investigation, but this is male number 1, who's seen both in the bar area and in the kitchen with a firearm. This is at the time of the shooting. We also determined through the video and investigation that the firearms were being kept in the refrigerator. And so this individual, both in the bar and then in the kitchen, so a synopsis of what he does that we can see on video, running first to the front door as people are running in during the course of the shooting. He appears on camera in the bar holding a gun. He goes into the kitchen with a gun, checks the bar, ends up going outside near the stage, and then comes back inside through the bar area to the kitchen. And keep in mind, while he's running around with this gun, both inside and outside, our officers are responding to the shooting scene, and multiple patrons are running in and out of the establishment. We lost our screen? Okay, there we go. Male number 2, this individual also armed with a handgun, both in the kitchen and in the bar. We can follow him on video doing very similar conduct. As people are running in, he pulls a firearm from his person and looks out the front door, then walks through the bar while holding the gun. He enters the kitchen, goes into the room behind the kitchen, walks back into the bar area, ultimately enters the kitchen and racks his gun. Enters the bar area, goes behind the bar, goes to the outside door near the stage. He lets male number 1 back in from outside. And remember, male number 1 was also armed. And then either stands in the doorway or goes off camera. He later enters the kitchen, opens a small fridge where male 1 puts his gun. Male 2 puts at least 1 gun. and then put it into a different storage area in the kitchen. He put his hands at the back of his waistband. Again, it's unknown if he had another firearm in his waistband at the time. It appears from the video that might be the case. And then he walks to the other room and then goes outside. This is male number 3, also armed with appears to be a handgun in both the kitchen and the bar area. He's doing similar conduct during the course of this ongoing shooting. At one point, he appears to put the gun into a bag he has over his shoulder, walks into the bar, and then walks outside through the front doors, and then back inside through the kitchen, and then ultimately back outside. We followed up with Mr. Brown because, of course, if these individuals are employees, he would know who they were, and it may be lawful for them to have firearms. If they are not, it is not lawful for them to have firearms. In interviewing Mr. Brown as to individual number 1, he identified him as a chief manager, but wasn't able to provide a name. He identified the second male as head of his security, who he named as Adrian, and he believed the third male was with security, but he couldn't confirm that. He told our detectives back on June 14th that he could confirm their identities and would get back to us. Of course, that has not occurred. So it appears that if they are employees, Mr. Brown does not know who they are, or they are not employees illegally carrying firearms throughout the premise during the course of this shooting. We did some additional follow-up. Again with Mr. Brown to try and clarify the security situation and who he knew to be armed, etc. It didn't get much clearer. He again identifies himself as the co-owner of the club. He told detectives that Mr. Schultz is primarily a financial partner and that Adrian Green is the general manager. Mr. Brown told our detectives that he oversees the bar and restaurant staff and has some oversight of the security staff. Again, a lot of confusion about who's in charge of security. At least 3 individuals were identified as being in charge: Adrian Rodriguez, Enoch Varkpa, and an individual known only as Spade. Green said Varkpa was head of security, but Varkpa told detectives that Rodriguez was in charge. Brown said Rodriguez was in charge of security, but a male named Spade filled in for Rodriguez on occasion. Mr. Brown told detectives he didn't know Spade's actual name, and as of this date, he's not been identified or interviewed. Most of the security personnel who have been interviewed indicated they report to Rodriguez. Rodriguez indicated he was the most senior security member, but he didn't hire or fire personnel, and he was kind of in charge of security and worked whenever needed. As far as employment of the security staff, they're mostly hired on an as-needed basis, according to Brown. Mr. Vakpa is the only security person on the permanent payroll. All other security are paid in cash. According to Mr. Green, security staff are trusted people that are hired on the spot, and Brown indicated that Spade paid security members using proceeds from the cover charge. Again, in regards to the questions about firearms being allowed in the club, again, inconsistencies. Mr. Brown said that only 3 people had his permission to have guns in the club: Rodriguez, Varkpa, and Green, but that no one else was authorized to have guns in the club. Again, looking at the photos, the only one he was able to identify would have been Adrian Rodriguez, indicating the other 2 individuals were not authorized to have those firearms. One point that was consistently brought up in the investigation in multiple interviews was that a pat-down was done on anyone entering or re-entering the club. It's unclear what the procedure for guns found on patrons was. Mr. Brown said he had never caught anyone in the club with a gun. Rodriguez said if someone tried to get into the club with a gun, he would not confiscate the weapon and he would have the patron secured in their car. Green confirmed this and added if the firearm was found, Varkpa would tell him about it. Varkpa told detectives that if a firearm was found, it would be turned over to Rodriguez and then to, quote, someone else. One of the bouncers interviewed by detectives said any found firearms were turned over to Rodriguez or Spade, who in turn would turn the guns over to Brown. The bouncer wasn't sure if the guns were given back to the customers at a later time. In any event, patrons bringing guns into a licensed tavern is illegal.
Chief, you guys went through all this at liquor control. Nancy, what was the
Yes.
recommendation from liquor control?
Heard? Okay. The recommendation was a 60-day suspension.
Okay. Commissioners have any questions of Chief or Nancy or Dave at this time?
I guess I have a question for Nancy. So we talked about this yesterday about some of these they're being paid in cash. And so to give an example, this Dominique McNair, he was a security person. Commissioner Strand always asks if there's been any injuries to workers. Obviously this was a death. And so workers' comp, there's a death. I believe there's a provision if someone dies that they're reimbursed from workers' comp. And so I think that will be one of the involvements. And if you don't mind, I'll just give you a list of the other entities that will be involved. The IRS, the ATF, the FBI, and obviously North Dakota Workers' Comp. But the thing that's alarming is, so they're all being paid in cash. The rent's being paid in cash. And so I'm not a detective, but that signifies the potential of money laundering. And so that's an ongoing criminal activity on top of the multiple other things. So this is, it's just so alarming, and so that's why I think we're justified in what we're doing. I do agree that he needs to have his opportunity to give his side of the story, and we will do that. But I totally support what Chief recommended, that if we would let this go on, and obviously this is the 4th of July weekend, if something bad were to happen, I think it would be on us. And so I appreciate the Liquor Control Board. Some of them are here today, but we took our action, and we were going to wait until the next commission meeting to address this. But I do, the chief basically is saying this is an urgent issue, and obviously with all these calls, this is a public safety issue. And so that's why I support it, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
I think Commissioner Preston, you had a question?
Yeah, if Chief Cebulski, if you could enlighten me in regards to why suspension versus revocation. It seems to me that there's plenty here for revocation. So could you explain that a bit more?
I would not argue against that, Commissioner. It's simply the commission's decision, unless the city attorney has any input. Merely recommended suspension.
If I could have a follow-up question too then, and maybe this is for Nancy, could you explain the process from here on out, whether the final decision is suspension or revocation?
Sure. The recommendation today is for an interim suspension so that additional time can be used to gather additional information regarding ownership, manager, conduct in the facility, other laws that may not be strictly complied with. So there's a need for further investigation potential, which would then put that hearing back for an opportunity then for the respondent, the licensee, to respond.
So if I could just add a comment here, Mr. Chairman, I have a concern about the application for this license and whether indeed it's the actual management and ownership of the business piled on top of everything else. So I would hope that we would have a conversation, whether it's now or later, about revocation. I do believe that all of the problems we're seeing here cannot be solved in a period of time in the near future. And I would hate to see this place open up again.
Mr. Gary?
If we do suspend the license, do we have to vote to give it back? Or is it, if we do a 2-month suspension, does it come back automatically after 2 months, or do we have to vote to give it back?
No, the motion is to have a subsequent hearing on this matter. This is an interim suspension, and then we will come back for a full hearing. And then you can make a decision whether it's to suspend, revoke, or take some other action.
Okay. Yeah, clearly there's a lot of issues here, and the more we dig, the more we're gonna find, I would assume. And just the list that was given here today, in my mind, is enough to take away a license, and I think that's the way we should move forward, but we'll let the process work out. I do have some other questions, though. Is this club the busiest for calls for service in the city of Fargo? Does this take up the most of your time as far as a bar goes?
As far as the bar, absolutely. I would say that, as you're aware, we've done some revising of the Liquor Control Board, and the police department has taken, I think, a change in terms of enforcement and communication with that new board about some liquor establishments that take an inordinate amount of our personnel resources. And in this one, especially since we've met in March and had discussions about this, has steadily increased in severity. And as has been mentioned, I have some very serious public safety concerns if it's continued to operate in the fashion that it's been operating.
I think that's valid, and I think that there's other bars in our community that need to be looked at as well, and we know who those are, and we know what they are. When I see here fights, I see here underage drinking, I see here a homicide with a gun. There's another bar in town that has had the exact same record over the exact same time period, and no one wants to say its name, and no one wants to get rid of their license, and I'm wondering why to this day we still aren't talking about it. So I'm happy to support this, and I hope that our police department and our liquor control board does the right thing and looks into those other bars as well.
Mr. Strand.
Thank you, Mayor. I have a similar question. In the last window of time, we've had a death outside the Hodo, a death outside the Bismarck, and a death outside of Rick's Bar. How do they differ from this situation? What's the threshold? Because the community will ask that same question. What's the difference in why this became over the tipping point versus other establishments that we have a knowledge of their challenges?
Sure, good question. In those other incidents, those are incidents that happen to occur at the bar. The shooting at the Bismarck was two individuals who had a prior dispute, who ran into each other at the bar, got into a conflict that led to a shooting. The other incidents, I'm not familiar with Rick's Bar in terms of the death, but none of those incidents are related to the business itself. In this example, this whole business is not only operating illegally by not keeping employment rosters, properly recording employee records, allowing people to bring guns into the facility, having them checked by a convicted felon, continuing to have instances of over-serving, and as I forgot to mention on the video, we can see a person purchasing a whole bottle of liquor. They don't have an off-sale license, which means I have to consume that whole bottle before I leave, in theory. And so that's the over-intoxication issues with the party bus, with the fights, whether we get there and people are gone or they're still there, is a continual drain on police resources. And then, of course, the firearms incidents, which again are the result of people having too much to drink and having disputes inside or outside of the facility. We're not seeing that in any of these other examples, but to Commissioner Garrick's question, we most certainly are tracking these in a more intentional manner, and we will continue to bring that information to the Liquor Control Board for their review.
Any other comments or questions? Mr. Strand.
Thank you. My brain is hazy on this, but I want to think or recall that there were questions about this license when it came to us for approval initially. And I want to say that there was some connection to some of the same folks having been disallowed a license in West Fargo. And I don't remember much of the detail of that, but
The husband had to change it to his wife to get the license.
so maybe we had some signals that there were problems coming our way. And maybe, however, going forward, we should pay more attention to those signals and really, really back up for the moment and reevaluate the concerns that are present. Because this might have all been nipped in the bud if we had not allowed this license back when people were questioning it being allowed.
Mr. Chairman, if I could make a
Commissioner
comment
Preston.
there. I agree fully. I would hope that, and that was my concern as well, that what is reflected on the application, on the final application that was approved, does not really reflect what's happening in the bar in regards to management and ownership. And I would hope that the Liquor Control Board would go back and look at the approval process for applications and transfers and make sure that that is absolutely squeaky clean. I would say that one needs to be looked at again.
Okay, any other discussion? Mr. Strand?
Thank you, Mayor. Is there an owner representative in the audience that we could hear from or not? I'd be curious if you have anything to say rather than us not listening. Could you go up to the mic, please?
I remind Commissioner Strand, he has a public meeting that they will go to explain their side. This
Yep.
wasn't announced as a public hearing.
I still would like to hear from the owner. I wouldn't
telling you.
mind. I think that's reasonable.
Sure. No, I'd be happy to speak to you and answer any questions you may have. I have appeared before you before as the attorney representing the ownership of this bar. There have been already significant changes in management. The previous management has been completely dismissed after the last meeting, where a number of surprising details came to light that the owners were not previously privy to. And they have hired me as the general manager in order to, as fast as possible, bring this business into full compliance with the law and fix all of the numerous issues. I have a plan in place to do that, and I agree that this litany of issues is very concerning, and I don't want to see any of that continue. I have a vested interest in this community remaining safe, and I don't want to allow things like this to continue happening. There is a path to operating this establishment successfully and safely, and I feel that I am going to be able to bring it down that path and bring them into full compliance with everything relating to the law. As far as the questions of ownership, just to clarify that completely, the owners and licensed parties are Balu Brown and Corey Schultz. The original proposal did have Francis Brown, who was then later acting as one of the managers, as the owner. And when he was ineligible for licensure, then his wife, Balu, agreed to take over ownership and co-run it with Mr. Schultz. That does reflect the actual ownership and the actual process of who is controlling the business. Mr. Brown has on multiple occasions identified himself as the owner. He has done so incorrectly, and that was in fact a lie. And that is one of the many details that has now come to light that led to his dismissal as the manager and bringing me on instead.
For the bodyguard that had his life taken, does he have any workers' comp benefits?
I believe he does. I'm not 100% certain on that.
I would like that to clarified before our next meeting, because family says he doesn't, so.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Mr. Chairman, could I ask one more question?
Preston, yes.
So maybe this is a question for Steve. When there is a change in management, is that something that has to be registered with your office?
Yes, we like to know when there's a change in management so that we have that local contact and we can get a response if we need that.
Could I ask one more question? So in that, because I remember seeing a lot of applications that had background checks done on management, is that part of the process of application and or updates, such as a change in management?
So at this time, what we do is we do the background check at the time of the application. Typically, when the management changes, we do not then run a background check just on the manager under the current.
So that's another part of the process where I would ask the Liquor Control Board to take a look at.
Okay.
And if I can just offer, in terms of the
Mr.
change-
Chairman, can we call the question?
Call the question. Mr. Strand.
Why call the question when we're not done discussing it? And you, just by asking for the question doesn't automatically trigger.
Absolutely
If that's
not,
what you
but
want,
I can make the statement, can I call for the
You
question? That's
certainly
what I
can.
just did.
And if you want, do it properly and
You know what,
make the
Commissioner
motion.
Strand, I can do that, can't
Yes,
I?
you can. Make the
Do I have
motion.
to ask your permission for it?
No, make the
All
motion.
right, thank you.
Make
I
the
call
motion.
the question.
Is there a second?
Is there a second? Does he need a second, John?
Yes.
Okay. What other discussion do you want? Commissioner Strand?
Thank you. Chief Zabulski, in your perspective, being rather new here, how many other bars are on your radar that may be coming to us if things don't improve?
Well, I don't know if I have an exact number. I think now that we are better tracking them, there are some that where we're having incidents, nothing at all anywhere near what's happening in this facility, but just general calls and things of that nature. So we'll be looking through those and letting the Liquor Control Board know about our contacts. It doesn't mean that we would necessarily request any action. It's more of an information piece. So as if things continue in some of these facilities, they're aware of the background and they can take appropriate action if they feel it's necessary.
Thank you.
Any other discussion? Roll call vote, please.
Pepcorn,
Aye.
Strand,
Yes.
Gary,
Yes.
Preston,
Aye.
Mahoney.
Yes. No other business at this board. We stand adjourned. Thank you.